broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another webinar from cpaacademy.org. My name is Jasmine, and I'll be your moderator for today's event, Diversity and Inclusion One-on-One, Understanding Identities. Our presenter today is Jina Etienne with special guest Sacha Thompson with the Equity Equation. Before we get started, though, I just want to do a quick check to make sure everyone can hear my voice and see the title slide of the presentation on screen. Please head over to the questions box on your GoToWebinar side panel and let me know that you can hear my voice and see the title slide. Also, feel free to let me know what city you're listening in from. Now, while we collect those responses, please also note this is where you'll let me know if you have any technical issues during the broadcast, or if you have any comments or questions for our presenters during the webinar. Loud and clear from Connecticut, Pennsylvania, California, New Jersey. Hello. Nice. Big group today, and so nice to see everyone can hear and see everything just fine. Now let's go through some housekeeping. This is a 1 CPE credit webinar. The way you earn that credit is fairly straightforward. Just stay logged in for 50 minutes and answer the poll questions. We'll have 4 polls today, and to earn full credit, you'll need to answer at least 3 of them. Finally, an archived recording of today's webinar along with your CPE credit will be available in your CPA Academy account within 24 hours. We also recommend that you download today's presentation materials, which can be found in the Control Panel's Handouts tab. Now that we're all set, let's welcome our presenter. Jina, our attendees are ready, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Jasmine, and welcome everyone. I was noting that the cities, Dallas is listening, Denver is listening. I just got back from Dallas. I'm going to go with yesterday because I don't really remember. And then Denver last week. So thank you all for joining us. I'm excited to be here for another edition of D&I One-on-One. Today, I'm talking with Sacha Thompson. Sacha is the founder of Equity Equation, LLC. That's a diversity and coaching and consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. I'm here in Maryland, so we're practically neighbors. And not only does she work with clients, but she teaches and advises other DEI practitioners like me who support underrepresented professionals in the companies that they work for. So I'm really excited today. Thank you for joining me, Sacha.
Thank you for having me, Jina. Nice to be here.
So before we jump in, these accountants, they like their CPE. Let's go ahead and launch that first polling question, Jasmine.
All right, and our first poll is launched. And just as a reminder, you need to respond to at least 3 for full credit today.
And I have to tell you, our attendees are so thoughtful. Karen's asking me about my arm. And I'm like, how do you even know about my arm? I hurt my shoulder 2 weeks ago, and I couldn't even move it. So it's better today. Thank you, Karen.
It must be contagious. I've had rotator cuff issues lately, so.
Yeah, I know I need to go get physical therapy because there's clearly 2 or 3 muscles spasming in my shoulder. But this is not why our attendees are here, because we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of health issues. We'll be here all day.
Yes, very true.
Awesome. Well, we definitely all wish you well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So I think I noted there 67% said no in terms of being familiar with the concept of intersectionality. So this is perfect because we have a great opportunity to sort of expand everyone's awareness, which is the goal of this session, these sessions. So Sacha, when we were talking about doing this concept of identities kind of naturally came up. Can you talk more about why this is such an important topic for you?
I think, and thank you. I think the particular topic has been one that people have lots of questions and not quite sure where to start, where to go, what to ask, especially in the workplace, right? So many of these things have been taboo, right? Oh, these are the things we don't talk about, or will be sent to HR, or these are the things, you just avoid, right? We're all the same. And I think over the last several years, what we've come to realize is who we are and what makes up our identities is how we show up at work, right? And so it's important to understand the identities or the lenses that people have when they come into the workplace, because that just shapes their entire experience. And so as organizations become more inclusive, it's important for them to understand some of those nuances, right? Because it does impact, how we approach this work.
Absolutely. And thank you, John, threw in the question a comment about the term. And yes, intersectionality is a term that was coined. It's not it. So it. Do you remember when it was? Was it in the 60s or the 70s?
I want to say it was the early 80s by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw.
Yes, 80. That sounds about right. And I love that term because none of us are one thing.
Right. And it was initially brought to the fold behind a court case. And so initially what happened was an African-American woman was suing her company and for discrimination. And what they found was, well, she wasn't being discriminated against for being a woman because no other, women were not experiencing those things. And she wasn't being discriminated because she was Black, because Black men weren't experiencing those things. And so it was that intersection of being a Black woman that was not being addressed because that was a unique experience. And so what you have found now in kind of the term intersectionality is understanding your different identities and what it means at that intersection, because that is unique.
Right, right. So I have on here, just for the screen, I just want everybody to see the topics that are listed here. This is not intended to be an agenda. We just kind of put together just a list of some things we might go and talk about. And so maybe we can jump in with, when you talk about identity, I know you have this concept called the identity iceberg. Do you want to talk about what that is?
Yeah, so we often, and it's not my, I've seen this several different places. And so what we all have are different aspects of our identity. So if we think of an iceberg, there's what you see above the surface and what's below the surface. And so we often approach people based on what we see above the surface, right? Gender or assumed gender, race, again, right. And so it's all of these things that we think are easy to identify. What we don't see is like someone's religion or sexual orientation, or their belief system, or if they're a veteran or not. Those are some of the pieces of our identities that are below the surface. And so I often ask my clients, or even when I'm doing workshops, we have the iceberg, and we're like, pick 5 of these identities that are most important to you, right? And oftentimes we notice that the things that are probably most important to me are some of those things below the iceberg, but nobody else sees that. And so how can other people kind of work with you or understand where you're coming from if they don't even see those aspects of you, and if that's important for you? And so I love to use that analogy when we're talking about identities, because again, we don't always know what's below that surface, and we can't assume that we all know what's above the surface either.
That is so true. And I think you mentioned this earlier, it's about our internal view of ourself. And I was reading the other day about the census results. We're still seeing more and more analysis come out of those, come out of that. And I saw that the number of people who identified themselves as multiracial increased by 276% from the 2010 to the 2020 census. And it's not because we had a 276% increase in the humans. It is about what you're talking about, this change of filter, this increase in awareness that we are more than one thing. And
no, exactly. That's it.
Yeah. And to your point, you got me thinking about the iceberg. And I'm thinking somebody sees me and they see that I'm Black, or at least I appear to be Black. And yet my internal identity is biracial. My mother's from the Philippines. Everybody hears me say this all the time. My mother's from the Philippines. My father is Black. And yet I still identify as Black. So it can get a little confusing, even for those of us when we're thinking about what is our identity, because it's fluid as well. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, yeah. It's ever evolving, right? And so, even for me, people assume Black American, they hear my voice, they don't know that I've had green card most of my life, right? I was born outside of the US. And so that my Caribbean heritage has shaped a lot of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
But unless you get to know me and see and understand that, or be a part of my family circle, you don't understand the influence that has on, or how I see the
Right.
world around me.
Right.
Right. And so I think what's important about the census data is we're not just check boxes, right? You can't just check a box and think that that's going to be the sum of everyone's identity. And even within that box, there's so much nuance within it as well, too.
Right. And it's funny that you say that, because so often that's exactly what we think about. We think, which is the right box for me? And we know that if I'm going to go with an I statement here, for those of us who are Gen Xers, we tend to be in the middle. If you're boomers, you tend to see things along the lines of, like the underrepresented minorities, like the way those groups have been classified is the way people think of diversity and inclusion. And millennials think of it in the way you're talking about, which is intersectionality, which is they're not any one thing. They're the sum of a bunch of different things.
Yep.
So
very much so.
I know there were a lot of things I'm sitting here looking at. There were a lot of things we were going to talk about. We've talked about intersectionality. Do you think we could jump over to talk about an identity as it relates to gender? Because that is an exploding conversation today. We weren't even talking about this 10 years ago, not the way we are today.
No. And it's interesting because when I do kind of my identities workshop, this is probably one of two areas that we get stuck in, right? Because we've been taught everything is binary, right? Male, female. That's it. There's no gray in between there. But there has been gray from the beginning of time. And so it's, how do you deal with that? How do you manage that? How do you kind of get out of that binary thinking, right? So you start to hear things like cisgendered, right? Which means that the sexual orientation or your gender that you were assigned at birth matches your genitalia, right? Versus transgender, where people do not feel as if they match how they were assigned, right? Or what their body, the genitalia is. And there's also gray within that as well, too. So we're starting to have more conversations around what it means to be, part of that spectrum. And there's more terminology that's always coming out. I was reading an article yesterday about, being asexual versus transsexual, and all of these different pieces, and how it all starts to come together, but how it's all being researched still as well, too. So it feels like, oh my gosh, tomorrow there's another thing that's coming out. Well, I think people now can identify what it is, right? What it is. And so those are the things that are starting to come up in the workplace as well, too. I think the last example was passports. Right now, you have the option of having an X as your gender, which people are just like, well, I've always had two choices. Now there's a third, right? And so what does that mean for me and how I experience the world, again, around me?
I should have been writing down all the things I was thinking about when you were talking. So I heard X, and what I'm thinking about there, and my reaction to that was, for those of us who are male or female, that's our identity, the X doesn't matter. And so we shouldn't be affected by it. On the other hand, for some, that is just so validating to be able to have an option that reflects them so that they don't have to straddle the line or feel like they have to be one or the other, and they're neither.
Right.
I know for me, that really resonated because I struggled as a kid when you had to check those boxes when it came to race. I genuinely didn't know what to check because the woman that I looked to every single day of my life, who was my role model in my life, was Filipino. I never looked at an African American, well, my grandmothers, my aunts, but my mother. And so when I would sit there and look at those boxes, I'm like, but how do I do this? Because if I check Filipino, people are going to think I made a mistake, Yeah. And then the other thing I wrote down is new words. I heard yesterday that Webster, I think it was, released something like almost 500 new words in the dictionary. And it made me think of what you were talking about, this language around gender, because so much of it is new. Are you finding that your clients in the workshops, when you say get stuck, is it because they are frustrated with the language, don't understand the language, never heard the language before?
All of the above, right? So it's first, let's have a conversation about gender. Then let's talk about sexual orientation, right? Like even breaking these things up, I think it's helpful because no one really talks about these things, right? Unless you're part of these communities or doing this work, you don't really talk about these things. And so, one of the most common statements that I hear is like, it's alphabet soup, right? LGBTQIA plus, what, it's just like, I don't know what it is. And so we spend time talking about each letter, right? And we use the plus to say, again, this is ever evolving, right? There's so many different pieces to this. Like we didn't talk about intersex, where people are born with both, genitalia, right? Or aspects of themselves that need male and female. And so what that even is like as an individual in the workplace, how, if there a transition there or not. So there's so many nuanced pieces to this conversation. But I think it's important for us to know, because if somebody is dealing with this, like mentally, or if they're in a workplace or a work situation where this is something in the back of their mind where they're thinking, okay, and this is just a data point, there are 19 states where people can be fired if they're LGBTQ plus, right? So think about that as you're looking for jobs, right? Or where you want to work, or even if you want to come out at work, because if there's a threat to your livelihood, right? If you show up authentically, like so many companies want you to show up.
Right. So here's a comment. It's a controversial one.
Okay.
But I want to ask it. And then after we're done this, Jasmine, just a heads up, we'll go to another polling question. I'm reading it word for word. This is a very one-sided conversation. A lot of us believe that gender is given by God and cannot be changed. Why should we be forced to change our beliefs? So is that what you're doing? Are you trying to get people to change their beliefs by talking about this language?
No, not at all. And it's interesting. I love how that's phrased. So the work that I do isn't about changing people's beliefs. You can believe what you want to believe, right? That's
we all
your,
do.
You're right. What this is about providing additional perspectives so that you are aware that not everyone experiences the world the same way that you do. Right? So you can believe what you want to believe, but that might not be what the person next to you believes. And so how do you create an inclusive environment and still hold on to your belief? That's part of the leadership challenge. That's part of this work. And it's really working through how to do that. Especially when we talk about sexual orientation, that's when religion tends to come in, right? Like that's probably one of the biggest areas of conflict. And again, it's not changing your religious beliefs. This is someone that's a preacher's child, right? So not telling you to change your beliefs, but to understand, one, not everyone has the same beliefs. And two, not everyone experiences the world in the same way. And so how do you just be respectful of where other people are in this process?
I would add to that, we don't all have the same vocabulary either. And so it could be that many of these words are just new words. And in order for me to relate to you and to really be able to connect with you, some of what I need to know is how to talk about something. Because I don't want to talk about something and offend someone. And I don't know about you, but I can sometimes feel self-conscious. I don't want to talk about something with someone if I don't really know how to talk about it. I just as soon stay quiet because I don't want to look stupid. And I don't want to be embarrassed, and I certainly don't want to offend. So I think there's some of that as well. But thank you for that answer. I mean, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and something that you just said was part of this is admitting that you're on a journey, right? None of us are experts in any aspect of this because it's ever evolving. And so one of the first things that I'll, tell people is, yes, I've been doing this for, over 20 years, but I'm still learning, right? And every single day there's an opportunity for me to grow and stretch and be uncomfortable in that growth process, right? And so I think it's being able to sit in that discomfort for a bit, to hear and understand other perspectives. That just helps me so much in my journey.
So I'm hearing some thunder a little bit. So if you hear it and it's coming through really loud, let me know. I'll just mute my microphone. So now I scribbled a word down here so I wouldn't forget it, and I can't even read my handwriting. Have you ever done that? Like I have no idea what I wrote.
I have my little, yeah.
So we're just going to go to a polling question while I see if I can remember what I was going to ask you.
All right, sounds good. And our second poll is launched on your screen now. Go ahead and respond within the poll, please. I do want to give this a full 60 seconds. We have such a large group today, and I want to make sure everyone can get their responses in.
The timing of this question couldn't be more perfect. How familiar are you with the terminology related to gender? Now, I still can't see the word. Oh, well. You know, next time memories go on sale at the store, I'm going to have to pick up a few because apparently I've lost mine. I will say one other thing. I've heard that, I know what I wanted to say, gendered language. There are languages that are very much gendered. If you think about a lot in the romantic languages, there's la and le and things that are words that are male and female. And then there are other languages and cultures that are sort of gender agnostic. There's no gender assigned to language. So it's just interesting that a lot of the gender conversation comes up more in those countries and in those cultures where language itself is very gendered.
Yeah, and that comes up a lot when we get into pronouns, and a very Americanized way of looking at things is the term Latinx, right? Because the X came to make it less gendered, but the language itself is gendered, right? So there's some nuance there too.
Right. So I'm looking at the responses. 49% somewhat familiar, 26% familiar, 11 very, and 11 not familiar. And then we have a few that said they prefer not to say, which of course is okay. I'm also looking at some comments. Thank you guys for putting, thank you everyone, I don't want to say guys, for putting these questions in here. I would rather us, address the comments and the questions going through, because this really is intended to be a conversation. And one that popped up immediately says, don't see any white people in your panel, doesn't seem very inclusive. And I just want to remind everyone that the structure of this webinar is really just a one-on-one and to have a conversation. And I have had, I'm going to go with, in quotes, white people as my guests. I've had guests from all the different dimensions of diversity. And I'm certainly excited about our next guest, who is a white woman, who we're going to be talking about gender issues, specifically as a woman in accounting. And so thank you for bringing that up. It was a great opportunity to remind the audience just about the whole platform here, the program. So I'm going to move us along. And then, even if you see questions in there, feel free to just bring them up. Another topic that you talk about is race. And I mentioned this earlier, that I'm biracial, but I identify as Black. Can you help folks understand what that even means? Not specific to me, but when we talk about race, it's complicated.
It's very complicated, right? And so when you think that race is really a construct, right? It's made up. But when you really break it down, it's two things. One, how we see ourselves, right? So how we internalize things, and also externally, how do others see us? And so those things may or may not align. And that's exactly what you were talking about, right? Like for you being biracial, you see both sides, right? That's who you are. So the world may not see that or may not see you in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's often that conflict. And so what we talk about with race is really just understanding that these are buckets, but they don't really mean anything, because there are, again, so many nuances within those buckets and experiences in those buckets. So for example, one of the questions that we get often is, do I use the term Black or do I use the word African American? I'm like, well, ask what somebody prefers, right? So for example, Black is a general term, right? It's part of the diaspora, the African diaspora. It can cover many parts of the world. African American tends to be a very US centric terminology.
Mm-hmm.
But also there's nuance in that, because there are many people that have immigrated from Africa that see themselves as African American, right? Or Nigerian American, or, whatever country American, and not the general term of African American.
Right.
And so it really is very nuanced. If anyone asks me, I'll say I'm Black. If they want a little bit more specificity, I'll say Caribbean American, or I'll say Barbadian American, right? To get really down to that. But it really depends on people's preferences, right? And that's what all of these identity areas are about. It's what people want to be seen as, right? What they want to, how they experience the world. And they get to choose how they do that, right? You don't get to choose that for us or for anyone. So, and the same, with when you think of indigenous populations or even Asian populations, there are over 400 languages spoken in Asian populations. And so when you think about that, like, how many experiences are there within that? Someone that is Korean is not going to have the same, maybe similar experience to someone that's Japanese, but there are cultural nuances that are involved as well too.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the cultures themselves can be a blend. I know that in my mother's family, if you go back a couple of generations, there's Latino influences.
Yep.
And so it's really, I often think, I thought this way as a kid sometimes, that how different I would be if I had been born in a different place. Don't ask me why. Why a kid thinks of this, but I remember thinking like if I were a butterfly and flew around and landed and just lived wherever I had landed, what would be different? And I realized a lot would be different, and it wouldn't be a question of good or bad. It's a question of different.
Yeah.
And part of that just made me question what I thought I knew or what I thought I believed. But all right, I'm revealing my issues. Another word that I thought of is
that, though. I'll say, just to piggyback on that real quick, I think that's why there's so many people doing ancestry.com right now, because you get to unpack some of those. Why am I the way that I am? Like, what has come through history, through my family, versus where I am located, right? And how that shapes kind of who we are. And it's right. You get to see some of that, the historical aspects show up in genetics.
So I finally remembered the word I wrote down.
Okay.
And I rewrote it so I could read it, and it is acknowledge. And I think one of the challenges we have is when we start having these conversations, I'm seeing some of the things coming through in the chat, in the questions, that it's almost as if our our dialogue is binary. Either you agree with me or you don't. Either you see it the way I see it or you don't. And and I think what's important for us all to remember is that you could say something, Sacha, and I don't agree with it. Or I could say something and you don't agree with it. Rather than focusing on trying to correct what you think, really one of the really important things to remember to do is just to acknowledge you. Just to say that I understood, I hear what you're saying. Because I'm not saying I agree with you.
Right.
I'm just saying I heard you. And that's because I know you don't want to be ignored and you don't want to be dismissed, and neither do I. Because sometimes that's what makes people get really mad, is I feel like you just dismissed me. And then I get defensive, and then we're not having a conversation.
Right. Well, and again, we operate in this world of, many people feel as if everyone experiences the world the same way that they do. And that's not true, right? And so one of the questions that I ask as I'm coaching is, what if there were multiple truths?
I love that question. Can I steal it?
Go for it, right? But what if there are multiple truths, right? What if what I'm saying is true and what you're saying is true? Because that's your experience, right? How do we then have a dialogue?
Right. Now, see, you want me to I wish I had pulled up that cartoon. I know many people have seen this cartoon. There are two people standing like this, facing each other, and in between them is a number 9. And so for this person looking this way, it does look like a number 9. But for this person looking at the same number, it's a number 6.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, who's wrong? If you really go with it, you have to either be right or wrong. We know that neither one of them are wrong. And both of them are right. It's a question of perspective. So I love that. I love that. All right. So I want to go back to the Q&A because we're getting a lot of questions. This is fantastic.
I was like, I can't even keep up.
Can't keep up with it. Somebody asked, could you just redefine the word cisgender?
Yes. So cisgender is when when you align, your gender aligns with what you were assigned at birth, right? So you're born, the doctor says male, female, right? And that's how you as you come to live, right, identify as male or female.
So I was born with female genitalia and I identify as a woman. So therefore I am cisgender.
Correct.
The next question, okay, where did it go? They're moving. See, when a new question comes in, they move.
They move, yeah.
I know it's in here somewhere. I'll find it again. But the question essentially is, I'm not going to, it's not word for word, but when we talk about cisgender, is it okay to say I'm a man, I'm a woman? Can I just say that? Is it offensive?
To just say that you're a man or a woman?
Is it offensive if I just say I'm a woman? Do I have to say I'm cisgender or can I just say I'm a woman?
Context matters, right? So my gut is like, no, I don't know who would be offended. But then there's people that could be offended, right? So I really think it depends on audience. It depends on, situations. One of the 8 places where this comes up a lot is even the use of pronouns, right? Mm-hmm. Typically, I'll have my pronouns in my email, usually on these calls for Zoom, especially, that I have it kind of built in there. Mm-hmm. And people ask, do I have to put my pronouns? That's up to you, right? That's my way of indicating that I just want to share that as being part of an inclusive community.
That's actually a question that came in about how do you find out somebody's pronoun? And I think the simple truth there is just to ask, what's your pronoun? And we're starting to understand that it's a more common question. I will tell you myself, if somebody asked me that 5 years ago, I'd have looked at them like, I'm sorry, what? Right. And so as you do more and more, as the vocabulary expands and we increase awareness around the vocabulary, I would say to answer your question though, I'm not walking around saying, hi, I'm cisgender. I'm not walking around saying that, although to your point, in certain conversations, I will say that because it relates to the dialogue. There are a lot of things that we just don't necessarily walk around revealing those things to each other. Some of us feel more private about information than others. And so this isn't about trying to force people to use language so much as being aware of the language.
Yeah. Exactly. And again, context matters, right?
So I'm looking at something else you said. Communities are not monolithic. Mm-hmm. I'm just pivoting us now to a whole nother conversation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a part of the workshop where we talk about how I'll just use this as an example, the Latinx community isn't a monolith, right? When you hear that, it's not that everyone that's a part of that community has the same experience. It varies. Right. And so for people to understand that, one of the places where I facilitate, they use the term paradoxes a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's this individual versus group paradox. Mm-hmm. And so individuals have unique experiences, but they may be part of a group that has some similarities in their experiences, but they're not exactly the same, right? And so it's being able to balance that. And I think our minds it's easy to just kind of box like, okay, all of these people have the same experience. All these people have the same experience. That's not the case.
Well, you know, I think to be fair, as humans, we tend to cluster. We do tend to organize ourselves around what's familiar, what's comfortable, and as a result, also what's similar. And so that's perfectly normal. And I think some of the conversation, it almost sounds like we're bad people for doing that. And I think it's important to remind everyone, no, it just makes us human. And it's absolutely okay.
That's just who we are as humans. That's how we are all built, right? Like that's fight or flight. You have to, you know, okay, what decision am I going to make? Like we just normally do that, right? That's part of our psyche. But I think to be more inclusive is to take that extra step. To really ask yourself that question, right? So one of the examples that I use often is a lot of organizations have, you know, employee resource groups or affinity groups, and they have a women's group. And I'm like, great. So how are you addressing the issues that Latina women have, or trans women have, or women with disabilities, right? So there's diversity within that group of just gender that's focused on gender. And so it's how do you understand that, again, people like, we're not monoliths, right? These groups aren't monoliths, and people have different experiences within. And a lot of this work is just really understanding how do you ensure that regardless of what your identity is, you feel valued, you feel like you belong, you're included, you're seen, you're heard, like all of those things that tie into belonging.
Right. So here you go, bringing up intersectionality again. Look at you. Bringing us right back to the beginning.
Who I am.
Right. I am going to, I know for a fact, there's no way we're going to get through all these questions with Q&A. So at some point, I think we're just going to, let's just talk about the stuff people are asking about.
Okay.
While though, I'm going to scan the questions. Maybe we can do our third polling question. Jasmine, while I scan the Q&A.
Absolutely. That third poll question is on your screens. This is the third of 4 polls today. And just as a reminder, you need to respond to at least 3 to get full credit.
There's a comment in here that says, by the way, the word human ends with man. You shouldn't use that gender specific word for everyone. And that's just an interesting comment. Some of that is the language thing. I know I say guys a lot, and I realize I need to stop saying that because not everyone I'm speaking to are guys. And even if they think they're all men, they might not all be identifying that way.
Right. True.
Let's see.
And I'll be closing this poll down in about 10 seconds. Three, two, one.
All right. So the question was, does your organization provide training specifically as it relates to race, privilege, and power? And the answer was 38% said yes. That's very promising because we're seeing more and more of that. Are you seeing that in your work with your clients, Sacha?
I am. I think what's interesting is we're having more conversations about, not about power per se, but about privilege and how do you use it honorably, right? How do you lend privilege? Because we all have some aspect of privilege. Right. And so when you think about it that way, it's like what you don't have to think about or navigate. And I use the example of disability a lot because, you know, when I come into a building, I don't have to think about, is there a wheelchair ramp or is there an elevator? You know, those are I just operate in that building. But somebody that's in a wheelchair has to think of those things, right? So the things that I don't have to navigate. And so as someone that is able-bodied, right, has able-bodied privilege, how can I use that privilege to speak up for those that may not even be in the room? And I think that's the piece that's when you start to pull into that conversation around power, right? Is I shouldn't have to be at the table in order for somebody to think about what's important to me. And so really kind of flipping it so that we're ensuring that everyone, right, the most marginalized within an organization is being represented, is being heard, is being thought about, and not always just doing what the majority of the group wants or needs.
I'm really excited to hear that, especially the way you just now talked about privilege and power, because I worry sometimes in this work around D&I that, and I'll admit I've heard this more than I would like, somehow we are always talking to white men or talking at white men as if they're the problem. And I think we need to make sure we're including everyone in this conversation. And when you hear privilege, I know a lot of people that I've spoken to, they hear privilege and it's a word that triggers them. Because we don't talk about privilege as something that we all have. And they're different privileges and they affect us differently. So thank you. I really enjoyed that definition. I think that was very helpful.
Yeah, and I think especially now with so many sensitivities, words can be weaponized, right? And so it's how do you truly understand where someone is coming from when they talk about privilege, right? And again, it's not taking that privilege away from anyone or making them feel guilty for having it, right? I cannot help that. I was born a woman, right? And then that, there is male privilege. I can't help that. What I can do is hope that my male colleagues see when women are being talked over in meetings or not being put up for promotion at the same rates as their male colleagues when they're doing just as much, if not more of the work oftentimes, right? So it's how do you use that privilege and your voice to speak up for those that may not look like you?
And, I'll flip that exact same example when you're talking about privilege that women have. If my child is sick and I get to use that card, if you will, I don't mean that in a negative way. And then there's a gentleman in my team whose child is sick and he wants to be able to do that same thing, take a half day, leave a little early, just talk about the fact that he's tired because he was up with his kid yesterday at night. And somehow the way that is received is different for men versus women. And so maybe there's a privilege here for women to be able to speak up on behalf of our male colleagues. And so I just shared that as an example because it goes both ways.
Exactly. And so it just takes us having these conversations where we realize, oh, this is a little unfair, right? How do we start looking at the equity of this?
The best thing I think is, I know for me, from my experiences, I'm always trying to learn more and understand new things. And when I say, wow, I never thought of it that way, that is the moment of awareness for me, because I just now added another drop in my bucket, just a drop. I'm going to try to get as many drops as I can. All right, let's see here. Oh, I asked that one. I didn't mark it as answered. How would you? Yeah, I'm just gonna start picking them. How would you go about correcting pronouns in meetings? Normally, the standard now is if you know that person's pronouns and you hear someone using the wrong pronoun, you just quickly correct and move on. But what is the best for an office setting?
I think it's the same, right? Just make the correction and move on. What I will say, I will add to that is follow up with that person later on, right? Just to preserve that relationship. Because I think oftentimes what happens is people get corrected and then they start to feel like, oh my gosh, no one's gonna, like all this anxiety starts to come up. Circle back around like, hey, I know we were just in this meeting and, you referred to so-and-so as she and their pronouns are they, them, right? I just want to, make sure you're okay with that. And, how can I help you as you're trying to work with this, right? And so like be an ally in that way. Sometimes the person that was aggrieved may say something, right? Or come back to you to say thank you. Because sometimes they don't want to always be the one speaking up for themselves, right? So just try to preserve, relationships, even in that discomfort is something that I would add.
And, it's what you said earlier, context. Context matters because sometimes this isn't the time to say anything. Sometimes the power dynamics in the room tell me I'm not going to say anything. Sometimes I'm uncomfortable saying something. And it wasn't even directed to me. I can see a situation where somebody said something and I don't understand the impact it has. I'm not sure the impact it has. So there are a million reasons why I wouldn't say something.
Right.
And I also have to be thoughtful that if I say something, I could have an unintended impact and just make the situation worse. So
Right.
at
Yeah,
the end of the
context.
day, all of this comes down to our respective filters, our own levels of awareness, the relationships we have with others, and the context that we're in when these things happen. I don't think you're trying to give any of us like hard and fast black and white rules here, but
No.
guidelines and sort of just understanding of broader concepts.
Right. And even just adding to what you said, right? If a situation comes up and it causes you pause, like it's like, okay, I don't know if I want to say anything. If that has done that to you, one of the simple things that you could say is like, I'm following up because it impacted me.
Yeah.
It may not have impacted the other person.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it takes the onus off of you speaking up for somebody else, and you're speaking up for yourself. Like,
right.
That caused me some pause. Let's talk through that, or, whatever the situation is. But I think that's a great example of when using those I versus we,
Mm-hmm.
because you can speak to how something has impacted you, right? You can't always talk about how it's impacted other people.
I can't assume.
Yeah.
We know what that word, it breaks down into 3 other words. I don't know we're allowed to say that on the air. But, somebody asks, what does it mean if someone identifies as non-binary?
So if someone is non-binary, they do not see themselves as either male or female.
Now, this is a good one. How do we respond to someone who tells us to not be so sensitive when we bring up a concern over a joke they may have made that we think of as insensitive toward a particular group?
So you're talking about a microaggression, right?
So what's a microaggression?
It's a microaggression. And so a microaggression is something that's often said or done that seems small, right? A comment, a phrase, a question, a compliment.
Yeah.
Right. That usually has a secondary message, right? So for example, right? Oh, you speak English so well. Okay, what's the secondary message there, right? You're not from here.
Yeah,
right?
Or I didn't know you're not supposed to be able to speak so well.
Right. You're so articulate, right? So we're expecting something else, right? And so there's always a secondary message that you have to kind of dig a little deeper in. But when I talk about microaggressions, I talk about there are 2 roles that are always in it, and possibly a third one, right? So you're either the person that has been the initiator, right? You've said it, it's been said to you, or you've witnessed it. The first question that you need to ask yourself was it intentional? Right? So if somebody said something.
But microaggressions are often not necessarily intentional, and people aren't even aware about them.
Exactly. So if it's unintentional, right? First thing you do is pause the conversation, right? Again, but a context, as we were saying before, matters. So you may say, let me address this later. You could address it in the moment. Pause the conversation. Say why you paused the conversation, right? I'm not sure. Oh, let me back up. Assume positive intent, right? Assume that.
Yes.
Okay. So, I know you probably didn't mean it, but what you just said kind of impacted me. Like, I want to talk about that for a little bit, right? And so again, you bring it back to the impact it's had on you.
Right.
Have the conversation, follow up with them afterward. The reason why I say, was it intentional or not intentional? Because sometimes people do things intentionally, right? And they know that they're just being sly and putting things out there.
And isn't that called a micro assault?
That's a micro assault, right? And so in those situations, again, if there's a power dynamic, if there's anything that's involved, document what is happening.
Now you're moving into the workspace area of harassment, which it's a whole nother conversation. Actually, you're just making me think I need to put that on the list of topics to talk about on this series. But I mean,
But
I
I
mean,
think
thank you for going through that, because I think a lot of times people will say something and, oh, you're just being sensitive. And maybe I am. And if I've offended somebody, if I've hurt somebody, I kind of want to know about it myself. And it might not have anything to do with these areas of these dimensions of diversity.
right. Now, what's interesting is microaggressions tend to attack someone's identity,
yes. And they
right? So it
tend to be targeting marginalized communities.
right. So it's those that are either by gender, sexual orientation, race, or ethnicity, right? It's those are the types of conversations that often come up. But I think it's important that that dialogue happens. And one of the questions that you could ask is like, well, what did you mean by that?
That's a good one.
Right. And so you're getting that person to correct, give them the opportunity to correct what they said.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, okay, if I'm being sensitive, what did you mean by it?
Yeah. I love when you say assume positive intention, because too often we want to just attack back. And curiosity is a beautiful thing. Because if you can just be curious and want to explore it a little more, it's really hard to be judgy in that moment. Yeah. All right, look, we could talk all day. I'm looking at the clock. All right. Here's one that came in. I think it's really powerful.
Okay.
As a guy from India, which is about 15% of the world's race, I always see that I am not recognized in any race. I have to join me as an Asian, which is mistaken for people from China. Is this situation changing? And is it because I live in America that this is going to keep me that way? And so this gets also back to the term Pan-Asian. Because
there's a lot to unpack in this. This is
so thank you. I don't even want to try to say this name because I don't want to mispronounce it, but thank you for sharing that comment.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting too, especially within the last year and a half, there's been more conversations around what has been termed by some like the invisible race, right? Because there's been this focus, particularly within the US, on Black and white.
Yes.
And this undercurrent of the model minority, that the issues and challenges that are faced within the Asian community have been overlooked, right? And the nuances within. And
all the ethnicities and cultures that make up Asian, because we talk about monolithic, we lump everybody into one bucket.
All into one bucket, right? And so then you start to think about, okay, well, what does underrepresented mean? And underrepresented whom and where, and all of these things. And so I think it's important to have those types of conversations, right? I read an article last year and my background is in tech, where there was this undercurrent of the caste system happening within tech, right? So the companies are seeing, oh, we have all of this Asian talent, right? Then when you break that down, it's all this Indian talent, but then there was a caste system that was happening within that, right? Which was causing discrimination and people feeling left out of conversations. So there's a whole nuanced area within the Asian community that I think we're starting to see more and more of those conversations starting to happen. And also organizations starting to peel away some of those layers of these buckets that we've put people in, right? Understanding that they're not monoliths.
Right. I just wrote down topics for the future: harassment, cultural awareness. Because to your point, particularly in the United States, we do think in terms of Black and white. And even there is a spectrum. If you just take those two races alone, it's a spectrum. So, just not necessarily exploring that. And then when we talk about cultural awareness, a lot of the D&I work is really around workplace culture. But culture is also a fluid concept. So,
and there's subcultures, right?
Yes, and those are normal, and that there's nothing wrong with that. So much of this conversation that you've shared with us today is really about raising awareness, because there's this sort of negative vibe with some of these things, that if I don't know these things, or we're hearing these words, and when I hear the word, it sounds like we're doing something wrong and they're trying to fix something. So understanding this language is so powerful, because it can take the stigma away and open up space for dialogue.
Right. And again, as you know, I said in the beginning, this isn't about changing people's minds at all, right? This is just giving you different perspectives to understand there are multiple truths, right? And that's what this work is about.
So something tells me you've been looking at the Q&A. You might have been peeking at it. I don't know.
I did not, actually.
Oh, no, because we have like 2 more minutes left where we can ask a question. I'm like, what's the best question that we could possibly ask? I'm just want to scroll through here. So many, you guys have put it, guys. See, I did it again. There are so many wonderful questions in here. We could do a 3-hour webcast and not get to all of them. So I'm really encouraged by the curiosity that everyone is showing.
Trying to see these questions. Oh my gosh. Okay. Mine is getting stuck, but that's okay.
Somebody asked, why can't we just identify as American? That might take away the confusion. And I'm thinking that might be true for the Americans, but that might not be true for those who are not.
Well, and what is American?
Well, but I understand the point. I mean, the point is, I know me, I was born and raised in the United States. I consider myself American, but I also have a complex ethnicity. So when we say American, are we talking about, the country where we were raised? It denotes a lot of things. And so all we're trying to do is expand the dialogue here just a little bit.
And again,
vocabulary, vocabulary.
Right. We're also in a country that was created on nuance. That's my word for the day. Right. And so the American experience for everyone is not the same. Especially when we don't want to face some of America's history or some of its citizens, right? So it's very, very, it's an interesting concept that I think if we wanted to unpack what does American mean, we would all have very different.
True. I agree with you.
Definitions of what that is.
And here's the thing about this whole conversation today. You can just, let's take all the words we've used and drop them in a bucket. And if we pull one word out, that word, whatever it is a word we could explore more. So I'm going to go with this last one. Actually, I have the answer already. It says, is there a plural form of they, or has the language not evolved for that situation yet? And the English Language Dictionary acknowledges the word they as both singular and plural. So there isn't a plural form of the word they. They is plural, if I'm allowed to say it that way.
Yeah.
All right, Sacha, thank you so much for joining us today, everyone.
Having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. We could talk forever. Before we go on, we have one final polling question. And no, I didn't forget. But I just want to encourage everyone to join us, invite everyone for the next conversation. Rosie Brammer will be joining me. She just started her own CPA firm. And we're going to be talking about, as women, what are the stories we need to challenge ourselves? How can we talk about changing our stories as we try to pursue our careers in accounting, given some of the stereotypes and some of the barriers women have faced? So this will be a conversation all about gender, and we're going to be talking about the accounting profession. So I hope you all can join us. And with that, Jasmine, I'm turning it back over to you to take us home.
All right, so I'll first launch our final poll that is on your screens now. Go ahead and cast your vote now. Thanks, as always, for responding so quickly and getting us through this presentation. This has been really insightful. I can tell just looking at the questions panel, everyone has learned something here. And as we mentioned before, if we didn't get to your question, don't worry. All questions will be shared with our presenters, and they will do their best to answer individually. I'm going to let this poll stay up for another 20 seconds or so.
While that's open, I have my contact information on the slide. I also know if you look at the slide with Sacha's bio information on it, her contact information is there as well. So you can reach out to us directly as well.
Yes.
All right, and I'll be closing that poll down in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, just want to thank you so much, Jina and Sacha, for this presentation and for helping our audience address these concerns. Thank you, audience, for all of your insightful responses. Definitely want to just let you know how much we appreciate your engagement. And with that, we have come to the conclusion of today's webinar. We here at CPA Academy will process your credit later today. That, along with a copy of this webinar and handouts, will be available in your CPA Academy accounts within 24 hours. Please also keep an eye out in your email inbox for an evaluation link for this webinar. Please check the schedule on our website for additional information, and we hope to see you very soon on a future webinar. Have a great day, everyone.